The Blackwoods, Alabama's most deformed family, were consumed by the diseases of their own consanguinity. Hidden deep in the Appalachian Mountains, among the dense forests and isolated valleys of Winston County, Alabama, lived a family whose very name still sends chills through the local population. They were known not just for their chosen isolation from the outside world, but also for the terrible genetic legacy carried across generations. This is the story of how the intertwining of family blood led to the emergence of one of the most genetically deformed lineages ever documented in American medical history during the 1950s. The discovery. The Blackwoods case came to light in April 1957 when Dr. James Harrington, a rural physician, was called to a remote property in the hills for an emergency. What he found would permanently alter his view on the limits of human degradation. Approximately 32 people, all belonging to the same family tree, were distributed across 3 small wooden houses on the 40-acre property. "What I saw that day will haunt me for the rest of my life," Dr. Harrington reported in his medical records, which were later released after his death in 1983. He documented children with atrophied limbs, adults with distorted facial features, and a pattern of mental deficiencies that repeated in virtually all younger family members. The Blackwood property lay about 14 miles from the nearest town in Winston County, a location so remote that they rarely received visitors. Even mail carriers avoided the area, leaving correspondence in an improvised box on the main road. The family patriarch, Elijah Blackwood, then 67, was known for his rigid control over his descendants and his hostility toward strangers. The Blackwoods sustained themselves through subsistence farming, growing potatoes, corn, and some vegetables on the rocky and fertile land. They raised chickens and pigs, seldom traveling to town for essential supplies. The isolation was not merely geographic, it was cultural and genetic as well. A tradition of consanguinity. This isolation began 3 generations earlier, around 1880, with the arrival of the first Blackwood to the region. Dr. Harrington had been called to attend to Martha Blackwood, a 16-year-old girl enduring complicated labor. Martha was both granddaughter and niece to Elijah, the result of a union between his own brother and his daughter. The baby was born with severe malformations, including extra toes and fingers, polyactyly, an abnormally small head, microcephaly, and congenital heart problems that led to its death just 48 hours after birth. This tragic event was only the beginning of the discovery of an alarming case of family consanguinity that spanned at least 4 generations. Marriages between close relatives had become an unbreakable tradition among the Blackwoods, justified by Elijah as a means to protect their lands from outsiders and maintain the purity of the family blood. The initial investigation revealed that of the 32 family members, 27 exhibited some type of physical or cognitive anomaly. The most common conditions included severe facial deformities, such as underdeveloped jaws and palate malformations. Reduced stature, with adults rarely exceeding 5 feet 3 inches in height. Intellectual disability, ranging from mild to severe. Vision problems, including partial or total blindness in approximately 40% of members. Congenital heart diseases. Limb malformations, such as extra or fused fingers. Dr. Harrington's notes describe William Blackwood, one of Elijah's sons, then 42, as having an asymmetrical face with widely spaced eyes, a significantly underdeveloped jaw, and an abnormal curvature of the spine that made him appear much shorter than he was. His wife and first cousin, Sarah Blackwood, presented coarse facial features with thick lips, a widened and flattened nose, and small, deep-set eyes. 4 of the couple's 6 children had severe intellectual disability, unable to articulate complete sentences even as adults. The most disturbing element, according to the doctor's reports, was the family's acceptance of these conditions as normal. They don't see these deformities as a problem, but as a family characteristic, he wrote. When questioned about marriages between close relatives, Elijah responded with disconcerting naturalness that it has always been this way and always will be. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. These dark stories of isolated communities reveal truths about our humanity that few have the courage to confront. You won't want to miss any of our next cases, documented with the same care and depth. Origins and escalation of isolation. The story of the Blackwoods darkens when examining their origins. Historical records indicate that Isaiah Blackwood, the first family member to arrive in the region around 1880, was fleeing unclarified crime accusations in Tennessee. Isaiah deliberately sought isolation, establishing himself in the remote mountains of Winston County with his wife, a small son, and 2 teenage daughters. A local census from 1890 already recorded that the family had grown significantly to 11 members living on the same property. What the records don't explicitly show, but what later investigations revealed, is that this growth was fueled not just by the arrival of new members, but by the birth of children resulting from relationships between the family members themselves. Letters found on the property dated 1910 show correspondence rejected from distant relatives who attempted to maintain contact, with handwritten responses by Isaiah, "We don't need anyone. We are self-sufficient and pure. The outside world would only bring corruption to our lineage." By the third generation, around 1920, the first clear signs of the genetic impact of this practice began to emerge. Although scarce due to the family's reluctance to seek medical assistance, local medical records show births of children with increasingly severe malformations. Dr. Ernest Miller, a physician who occasionally attended emergencies in the region during the 1930s, documented in his personal diary, "I was called to the Blackwood property after a difficult birth. The child presented a condition I had never seen before. Multiple malformations in the limbs and face and an almost animalistic behavior from the mother who refused to let me properly examine the newborn. The child's father, who was also the mother's cousin, showed similar signs of atypical facial development." The Great Depression of the 1930s intensified the Blackwoods' isolation. While many rural Alabama families migrated to urban centers for work, the Blackwoods entrenched themselves further on their property, surviving through hunting and subsistence farming. This period also marked the beginning of Elijah's leadership after his father's death in 1932. Under Elijah's command, the practices of consanguineous union were actively encouraged, not just continued. Local school records show that the few Blackwood children who attended the county school in the 1940s were withdrawn after a few months. Mrs. Dorothy Wilkins, a teacher from that era, recorded in school reports, "The Blackwood children demonstrate significant difficulties in socialization and learning. In addition, they present distinctive physical characteristics that make them targets of ridicule by their peers." The children stopped attending after complaints from Elijah Blackwood about the treatment his nephews and children received. The isolation became not just a personal choice, but a reaction to increasing stigmatization. Residents in the region developed an almost superstitious fear of the Blackwoods, with exaggerated stories about their behavior and appearances spreading throughout the county. Terms like deformed creatures living in the mountains or the cursed people of the hills were commonly used to refer to the family. A significant incident occurred in 1945 when 2 young Blackwoods, Daniel and Joseph, cousins and also half-brothers, went down to town for supplies. Their appearance caused such a commotion that frightened customers chased them out of the local grocery store. The local sheriff, Thomas Walsh, recorded the incident. "The boys did not demonstrate aggressive behavior, just an extremely unusual appearance, protruding jaws, eyes set very far apart, and a form of communication almost incomprehensible between them. I had to escort them back to the mountains to avoid further confrontations." This event only solidified Elijah's resolve to keep his family entirely isolated from the outside world. From 1945 to 1957, the Blackwoods were rarely seen in town, with the exception of Robert, Elijah's oldest son, and Elijah himself, who occasionally went to buy essential items such as tools, ammunition, and salt. World War II did not directly affect the Blackwoods. No family member served in the armed forces, partly due to their intellectual and physical conditions and partly due to their invisibility in official records. Many deaths and births within the family were never officially registered, creating a phantom population that existed on the margins of American society. It was in this context of extreme isolation, consanguineous marriage practices established for generations, and social stigmatization that Dr. Harrington found the family in 1957 when called to assist in Martha Blackwood's complicated birth. The medical study and ethical dilemma. After his first contact with the Blackwoods, Dr. James Harrington returned to town facing a professional and ethical dilemma. As a doctor, he immediately recognized the classic characteristics of a population with a high rate of consanguinity. He also realized he was dealing with an extreme case that could contribute significantly to medical knowledge about the genetic effects of these practices. Harrington discreetly consulted with colleagues from the University of Alabama and gained the support of Dr. Walter Thompson, a geneticist who had studied similar, though less severe, cases in isolated European communities. In June 1957, 2 months after the initial incident, the two doctors returned to the Blackwood property with a carefully planned approach. "We couldn't simply arrive and announce our study intentions," Thompson wrote in his subsequent report. "We approached by offering medications and free medical assistance, knowing the family had little or no access to regular healthcare." Elijah Blackwood, though initially hostile, eventually allowed the doctors to examine some family members, especially after realizing that his granddaughter Martha was still suffering from postpartum complications that weren't healing properly. This limited opening allowed the doctors to begin what would become one of the first documented studies on the extreme effects of consanguinity in an isolated U.S. population. Over 3 subsequent visits, always under the guise of medical follow-up, the doctors managed to collect crucial data. Partial medical history of 27 family members. Anthropometric measurements of 19 individuals. Photographic documentation of 12 members, with reluctant permission. Blood samples from 8 people for basic laboratory analyses. The technological limitations of the time prevented the sophisticated genetic tests available today. Yet, even with basic methods, the results were alarming. Blood analyses revealed high levels of homozygosity, the presence of identical genes inherited from both parents, a clear indicator of consanguinity. "What we are observing in the Blackwoods," Dr. Thompson wrote in his 1957 notes, "is a dramatic amplification of recessive traits that would normally remain dormant in populations with greater genetic diversity. Each generation intensified these traits, creating a cascade effect that resulted in the severe physical and cognitive manifestations we have documented." Specific conditions identified included Apert syndrome, premature fusion of skull bones, in at least 6 members. Polyactyly, extra digits, in 11 individuals. Intellectual disability, ranging from mild to profound, in approximately 70% of the family. Achondroplasia, a form of dwarfism, in 8 members. Hemophilia in 3 men of the family. Retinitis pigmentosa, progressive degeneration of the retina, in almost 40% of individuals. The study also documented an alarming infant mortality rate. Approximately 60% of babies born into the family in the last 2 generations did not survive beyond the first year of life. Those who survived often developed multiple debilitating conditions throughout childhood. One of the most impressive documented cases was that of Samuel Blackwood, 19, son of William and Sarah. The young man presented a rare combination of conditions: an extremely underdeveloped jaw, severe microcephaly, multiple extra fingers on both hands, vision limited to the perception of light and shadow, and a stature that did not exceed 4 feet 7 inches. Despite these physical limitations, Samuel demonstrated surprising musical abilities, able to reproduce complex melodies on the banjo after hearing them only once. Cases like Samuel's represent the complexity of human genetics, Thompson observed. Even in conditions of extreme genetic limitation, unique and unexpected characteristics can emerge, reminding us of the unpredictability of gene expression. During one of the visits, Dr. Harrington managed to establish a deeper dialogue with Abigail Blackwood, 52, Elijah's sister and one of the few family members who had significant contact with the outside world in her youth. Abigail revealed she had briefly worked as a domestic servant in Huntsville, returning to the family property only when her father fell ill. "They don't know what they're doing to themselves," she confided to the doctor. "I see our children being born weaker and stranger with each generation. I tried to talk to Elijah about bringing new blood into the family, but he says the outside world will corrupt us. He doesn't realize we're withering from within." Have you ever wondered what secrets isolated families hide on their remote properties? Leave in the comments. The mountains hold truths that society prefers to ignore. Your participation helps us continue bringing these impactful stories that few have the courage to tell. Intervention and gradual change. In August 1957, the doctors presented their preliminary findings at a small medical conference in Birmingham, maintaining the family's anonymity by referring to them only as Family X from northern Alabama. The presentation generated considerable interest in the regional medical community but also raised ethical questions about intervention. We are facing a population that voluntarily isolated itself and maintains practices that clearly result in physical suffering for subsequent generations, argued Dr. Thompson during the conference. As health professionals, do we have an obligation to intervene, or should we respect their cultural autonomy even when it results in severe genetic damage? The fall of 1957 marked a turning point. Following the medical conference presentation, the case attracted the discreet attention of the Alabama state public health authorities. Concerned with the implications of the case, the state health department sent a small multidisciplinary team to assess the situation, including a legal representative, a public health nurse, and a social worker. The arrival of these authorities at the Blackwood property in October 1957 was met with open hostility. Elijah, wielding a shotgun, initially refused them entry. Dr. Harrington, who had gained a minimum of the family's trust, had to intervene to mediate. "You have no right to interfere in how we live," Elijah shouted at the team, as later reported. "Our rules, our land. We've been here for 3 generations and nobody ever cared about us before." The public health team documented precarious living conditions in the 3 houses, absence of electricity or running water, rudimentary sanitary facilities that contaminated the family's water well, and general hygiene conditions that aggravated existing health problems. 5 school-age children received no formal education, and several family members presented treatable medical conditions that had been neglected for years. The official report, written by social worker Margaret Collins, described, "We found a family living in conditions that go back a century, both in social practices and material terms. The children show evident signs of chronic malnutrition, aggravating the congenital conditions already present. Several adults suffer from easily treatable diseases such as chronic respiratory problems and severe dental infections without any medical intervention." The situation presented the authorities with a complex dilemma: on one hand, clear violations of public health and child welfare laws; on the other, forced intervention could traumatize an already isolated and fragile community. The health department opted for a gradual approach, beginning with offers of education and immediate medical assistance before considering more drastic measures. However, unexpected events accelerated the intervention process. In November 1957, a strong storm hit the region, causing a landslide that partially destroyed one of the houses on the property. 2 family members were seriously injured and transported to the county hospital, marking the first time many of the younger Blackwoods had left the family property. This incident provided an opportunity for authorities to intervene more directly. While the injured received treatment, social workers were able to talk with other accompanying family members, including 3 teenagers who demonstrated curiosity about the outside world. Rachel Blackwood, 16, who had mild intellectual disability but less severe facial deformities than other family members, expressed her desire to properly learn to read. "I know I'm different," she told the social worker. "But I want to know things that are in books. Dad says we don't need that, but I dream of knowing what's written on the boxes we bring from town." This openness from some younger family members, coupled with the practical need for assistance after the landslide, created a breach in the isolation the family had maintained for decades. In December 1957, an agreement was negotiated. The county would offer ongoing medical assistance and materials to rebuild the damaged house in exchange for permission for the school-age children to receive basic education from a teacher who would visit the property 3 times a week. Elijah reluctantly accepted, mainly due to pressure from other adult family members who had witnessed the benefits of contact with the outside world after the landslide incident. This small concession marked the beginning of a slow transformation. Esther Jenkins, the designated teacher, an experienced 58-year-old educator who had worked with isolated rural communities throughout her career, began her visits in January 1958. Her personal diary, later donated to the County Historical Archive, offers an intimate glimpse of this process. "My first day with the Blackwood children was a challenge like no other in my 30 years of teaching. 5 children between 7 and 16 years old, non-literate, all with some degree of physical and cognitive disability. But what impressed me most was their hunger for knowledge, an almost desperate hunger for information about a world that had been denied to them. Little Timothy, 9 years old, with his asymmetrical face and extra fingers, spent almost an hour fascinated with a globe I brought. 'Are we really so small in the world?' he asked with eyes wide with astonishment." Throughout 1958, the regular presence of teacher Jenkins and occasional visits from health professionals began to have a noticeable impact. Chronic medical conditions were treated, and 3 of the children learned to read at a basic level. Gradually, Elijah's initial hostility diminished, although he maintained his distrust of the outside world. A significant turning point occurred in September 1958 when Martha Blackwood, the young woman whose complicated birth had initiated the whole discovery process, expressed her desire to leave the property and seek treatment for her persistent health conditions. At 17 and now literate thanks to Mrs. Jenkins's classes, Martha had developed an understanding that her life could be different. "I don't want anyone else in our family to suffer as we have suffered," Martha told Dr. Harrington during a consultation. "If what you say is true about our problems coming from marriages between relatives, then I need to leave here." Martha's decision to leave the property, accompanied by 2 teenage cousins, triggered a family crisis. Elijah initially threatened to use force to prevent them, but the mediation of Dr. Harrington and the intervention of the local sheriff resulted in a tense agreement. The young women would be allowed to leave, provided they remained under the supervision of social workers and maintained regular contact with the family. This event marked the beginning of the gradual dissolution of the extreme isolation that had defined the Blackwoods for generations. In the following years, between 1958 and 1965, more than half of the younger family members chose to leave the property, many seeking medical treatment for their conditions in specialized institutions or integrating, to the extent possible, into broader society. Legacy and scientific contribution. The early 1960s witnessed profound changes in the Blackwoods' history. The property, which had been an isolated enclave for almost 80 years, began to gradually open to the outside world. Elijah Blackwood, the inflexible patriarch, faced not only the loss of his absolute authority but also a reality that contradicted everything he had believed for decades. In January 1962, Elijah suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and dependent on care, a situation ironically symbolic for a man who had valued isolation and independence so much. Under the care of his sister Abigail and with regular medical assistance now available, he lived 5 more years, passing away in 1967 at the age of 77. During these last years, Elijah witnessed transformations he certainly considered the destruction of his way of life. William, his eldest son, assumed family leadership and, influenced by new ideas brought by educators and health professionals, began to implement significant changes on the property. The main house was renovated with social assistance funds, gaining basic electricity and plumbing in 1963. An improved access road was built the same year, allowing vehicles to reach the property even during periods of heavy rain. The younger children began to attend the local school, albeit with special support due to their specific needs. Dr. Walter Thompson, who had begun his studies with the family in 1957, continued following the Blackwoods case for more than 2 decades. In 1972, he published a seminal article in the American Journal of Human Genetics titled Multigenerational Effects of Consanguinity in Isolated Populations, a case study from rural Alabama. The article, which maintained the family's anonymity using the pseudonym Alpha Family, meticulously documented the genetic effects observed over 5 generations. Thompson's work became a reference in the field of population genetics, contributing significantly to the scientific understanding of the effects of prolonged inbreeding in human populations. Among the most significant findings documented by Thompson were the progressively more severe expression of recessive genetic conditions with each generation, the emergence of rare combinations of conditions that are rarely observed in populations with greater genetic diversity, the dramatic reduction in the viability and fertility of births in recent generations, the occurrence of unexpected characteristics in some individuals, such as specific talents amid widespread disabilities. The study also documented the improvement in the general health and development of the younger family members after the 1957-58 intervention. Children who received adequate education, medical care, and nutrition showed better cognitive and physical development compared to their older siblings and cousins, demonstrating the powerful impact of environmental factors even in cases of significant genetic predisposition. A particularly notable aspect was the follow-up of the young women who left the property in 1958. Martha Blackwood, whose difficult birth experience had initiated the entire process, eventually settled in Birmingham, where she received treatment for her medical conditions and learned basic sewing skills. Although never able to live completely independently due to her limitations, she found purpose working in a craft program for people with disabilities. In a 1975 interview with a local newspaper, Martha, then 34, reflected on her journey. "I was born in a place where we didn't know there was another way to live. We believed we were as we should be. Now I understand that much of our suffering could have been avoided. I don't blame my grandparents or parents. They did what they believed was right. But I'm happy that our story can help other people understand the risks of this kind of isolation." Other young adults and children who received medical and educational intervention had varied outcomes. Some with more severe disabilities were eventually placed in specialized institutions as their family caregivers aged. Others achieved surprising levels of social integration, especially those who had been exposed to education earlier. The Blackwood property gradually decreased in population. Of the 32 members who lived there when Dr. Harrington made his first visit in 1957, only 12 remained in 1975. The land, which had been kept isolated for so long, was partially sold to neighboring farmers, with a small central portion still occupied by descendants of the family. The Blackwoods case had ramifications beyond the immediate family. In the 1970s, it influenced public health policies in rural areas of Alabama, with specific programs being developed to offer assistance and identify isolated communities. Health professionals received training to address the issue in a culturally sensitive manner with affected communities and recognize signs of consanguinity. In medical schools across the southern United States, the case study of the Blackwoods, always presented with pseudonyms, became part of the medical genetics curriculum, dramatically illustrating the risks of prolonged consanguinity. Dr. Thompson frequently commented that the story of the Blackwoods is both a lesson in genetics and a lesson in humility for medicine. A reminder that entire communities can exist on the margins of our health systems, facing suffering that could be mitigated with proper intervention. In 1980, a team of documentarians from the University of Alabama received permission from William Blackwood, then 65 and the last of Elijah's children still alive, to create a historical and educational record about the family. The documentary, titled Isolation in the Mountains, A Story of Rural Alabama, was produced with sensitivity, maintaining the family's anonymity and focusing on the social and medical aspects of the case instead of exploiting the sensationalism of the physical deformities. The film, shown only in medical and educational contexts, included interviews with professionals who worked with the family and some Blackwood members who consented to participate. One of the most eloquent participants was Rachel Blackwood, then 39, who had become an informal advocate for the rights of people with disabilities in her community. "People look at families like ours and see only the different, the strange," she said before the cameras. Her face, with distinctive features but undeniable dignity, they don't see the real people behind the appearances. Each of us has a story, fears, dreams. What happened to our family is a tragedy that could have been avoided with support and knowledge. I hope others can learn from our experience. The Blackwoods' genetic legacy continued, albeit in a diluted form, in subsequent generations. The younger members who left the property and eventually formed families did so with unrelated partners, resulting in a rapid decline in the incidence of severe deformities in just one generation. A follow-up study conducted by Dr. Thompson in 1985, shortly before his retirement, documented 43 direct descendants of the Blackwoods living in various parts of Alabama. Of these, about 30% presented mild to moderate genetic conditions, a dramatic reduction compared to the almost 85% observed in the previous generation. The case of the Blackwoods, Thompson wrote in his final conclusions, demonstrates both the resilience and fragility of the human genome. In just one generation of genetic diversification, we observed significant improvements in the health and development of descendants. However, certain conditions persist, reminding us of the lasting impact that consanguinity practices can have across generations. The original Blackwood property, reduced to less than 10 acres, remained occupied until 1992 when Thomas Blackwood, Elijah's great-nephew, passed away at 62. The land was sold, and the original structures, deteriorated by time, were eventually demolished. Today, few physical signs remain of the site that housed one of the most documented stories of family consanguinity in the United States. Visiting the site where the Blackwood property once stood today is a silent experience. The forests and mountains remain indifferent to the human drama that unfolded there for decades. A small plaque placed by local historians in 2005 marks the site with a simple text: "On this site lived a family whose experiences significantly contributed to the medical understanding of genetic isolation and the importance of human diversity." The last known descendants of the Blackwoods are now dispersed, many having adopted new surnames and integrated into communities where their family history is unknown. Some maintained contact with each other, united by shared experiences and bonds of kinship that few outsiders could fully understand. In 2007, on the 50th anniversary of Dr. Harrington's initial discovery of the family, the University of Alabama School of Medicine held a symposium on genetic isolation and public health, lessons learned and future challenges. Among the speakers was Michael Thompson, son of Dr. Walter Thompson and also a geneticist who had inherited his father's research files. "The case of the Blackwoods is not just medical history," he stated during the event. "It's a study on how isolation, geographic, social, and genetic, can shape human destinies. It's also a story about how compassionate intervention can alter trajectories that seemed inevitable. 50 years later, we are still extracting valuable lessons from this remarkable family." Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Blackwoods is educational.